Hello, welcome to A Lesson Before Writing, episode 17. I'm Ted Morrissey, and I'm here with my co hosts, Grant Tracy and Brady Harrison. I'll just quickly mention Grant's book, Neon Kiss, a Hayden Fuller mystery, which is our last Hayden book that we've had out, but we are getting pretty close to getting a new Hayden Fuller mystery out, A Shoeshine Kill. My goal was to get that out before the holidays, and I guess it's still possible. So we're working on that. And then Brady, his most recent book that we have is The Term Between, collection of stories, and it won the High Plains Book Award. Very cool. We're also working on his book, A Journey to Al Ramel. I just got another round of corrections from Brady just a few days ago, and so that continues apace. My most recent book is The Strophes of Job, out in paperback. It's gotten some nice reviews, so I appreciate that. And then I was going to mention, while I'm at it, my book, which I've talked about before on the podcast, my trauma theory book, Trauma Theory as an Approach to Analyzing Literary Texts. And it's a academic book, a scholarly book, and it's about trauma theory and the idea that cultural trauma, and personal trauma too, but how they impact the arts and particularly literature. I bring it up for a couple of reasons. Again, maybe one is that I think a lot of us are experiencing some cultural trauma over the most recent election. I could be mistaken about that, but also earlier this week I had the privilege of giving a lecture remotely to the National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad, Pakistan. And the way that came about was the professor that arranged it had contacted me a couple of years ago when she was just writing her dissertation. And she was basing her dissertation on my dissertation, or my book, in other words. And so anyway, that's how we kind of connected. And then she invited me to participate in the seminar and to give the lecture and that kind of thing. And so that was terrific. And one of the things I talked about in that lecture was both they wanted me to talk about psychoanalytic criticism, so most of it was about that, but they also wanted me to kind of speak to being a writer and how that works, in terms of, how does my psyche, I guess, affect me creatively. And so I kind of want to get into some of that this podcast. I think that's some interesting stuff to talk about. So I'll maybe stop there, but and get back to that. And I will mention that for anyone who's new to the podcast, we have a featured short story that we'll talk about later in the podcast. So let me just kind of open it up to you guys in general, though. I haven't really been in too close of contact or communication with you for a while. Like I said, Brady got to me some new, hopefully final, maybe near the final corrections for A Journey to Al Ramel. What's been going on? What have you guys been up to? Let me kick it over to Brady, first of all, perhaps, besides correcting proofs for about the 400th time on your book. What else have you been up to?
Oh, well, yeah. Yeah, it's one can say for folks who are interested in the writing life and in publishing and submitting to journals, everything takes longer than you hope. I'll go on the record. A Journey to Al Ramel, is exceeding the amount of time it would take to walk to the actual place, from my house to the actual place in south of Morocco that I base Al Ramel on. What I've been up to is the usual, particularly as the end of semester closes in. So I've been working on two writing projects, a novel set in Montana, and then because of the pressures of the semester, thought I might set that aside till I could concentrate, and then started a new story that and a scholarly article that I hope to finish over the break, as well as get back focused on the novel. So chipping away. I think in terms of morals of the writing life, and Grant's a hero of mine, and so is Ted. be consistent, keep working, if you enjoy it. And yeah, so kind of enjoying the three projects I'm working on. I suppose one disperses energies by going in three directions at once, but for me, that's kind of a minimum. So yeah, that's what I've been up to.
All right, all right. Grant, I know you had your the staging of your play, and you're looking at doing a film in 2025. That's exciting. But besides that, what have you been up to?
Well, a couple of things. I'll have to send you guys a link, but I've been doing a small serialized, kind of like the old Republic serials, where I play a superhero called the Waverly Phantom. He's a guy in his 60s who's a little delusional, and kind of like, if you remember George C. Scott in They Might Be Giants, who thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. I think I'm the Waverly Phantom, and it's based loosely on Don Quixote, and the Chrome Dragon will make an appearance here pretty soon as a nephew who decides to reach me on my level. He too has to dress like a superhero. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun. They're 10-minute episodes. We did the first one, and now we're just finishing up episode 2. And they're comic. I don't know. It's like a 64-year-old Buster Keaton. But I will send you guys links to that when we get done with the second one. And then I got inspired by our talk, our last podcast, that Halloween podcast, and I was watching a bunch of Val Lewton films, and I really got enamored with The Seventh Victim, which is about a satanic cult. And I thought, what better stuff for Hayden Fuller to get mixed up in than a bunch of Satanists? So I wrote a short story for a call. There were a couple of different journals that had like Halloween themed issues, so or Christmas horror themed issues coming up. So I submitted to those, and that short story is now going to turn into the 6th Hayden Fuller novel called 5 Points of Death. So that's get it, the pentagram. Yes. So anyway,
Wow.
he's gonna like mix up. But the part that's really exciting, the breakthrough for me, it was just a little part in the short story. But for the novel, I have more space to play. But I just had this one little idea where he's got a 5-year-old daughter now, Connie, who shows up in the one that's forthcoming, Shoot Shine Kill, and the demonic forces. So there's a lot of supernatural shit going on in this one. Start to enter his home, and that's when it gets really scary, because it's now trespassed into his home, and his daughter starts speaking in Latin and saying weird things. He doesn't know what she's saying. She's never spoken Latin before, and she's obviously been possessed by this strange cult that requires total silence from its members. That's where I got the idea of Seventh Victim from. And if you speak about the cult, then you must die. And so there's this famous painter who paints people who are dying, like in hospice care or palliative care. And she painted a famous painting, and that's sort of the trigger for the mystery. So anyway, and it was all inspired just by our chit chat on ghost stories and stuff. So yeah, that was feeding the lake with those ideas. So I'm excited to get working on that.
Well, that's terrific. Gosh, I didn't anticipate such a fulsome report, but I guess I should have. Oh, Brady has his hand up. Yes, Professor Harrison.
Well, I just got to say, for the record, we can't leave Grant unattended. Like, we don't know what he's doing. You have to keep a closer eye on Grant.
And for anyone who's new to the podcast, let me just underscore that we tape every month. So it is like it's been 6 months since I asked Grant what he was up to. It's been like 4 freaking weeks, and this is all brand new information. So yeah, no, that's fantastic. I have been kind of between a couple different projects, a dystopian sci-fi thing and this historical novel, which is based on a character inspired by Edgar Allan Poe. And I was kind of vacillating between which one of those I really wanted to dive into. Oh, not to mention my weekly, efforts at translating Beowulf. But I got this idea for a short story, and that's very weird for me. Normally, I just get ideas, and I don't know what they are, and normally they turn into much longer than I would like them to be, But I conceived of this idea for a short story, and lo and behold, I took about a month or so, and it turned into a short story. But two things were kind of the I guess the main inspirations or whatever. Excuse me. I had mentioned, that the previous year in 2023. I had, and I guess in recent years too, I'd been doing quite a bit of traveling to Vietnam and to Morocco and to Mexico last summer. And I really wanted to write things set in those places, but for some reason I was having a hard time sort of filtering that into fiction as opposed to just like travel writing. But I got this idea for a story set in Mexico. And then I've always been intrigued. We've mentioned Robert Coover's story, The Babysitter, this classic short story, which is sort of self-contradictory. It has all these little vignettes where they can't all be true. And Coover never helps us understand what may be true. So anyway, I ended up writing this short story set in Mexico in little vignettes and purposely make them sort of self-contradictory, so it's not quite clear what's happening. Now, maybe no one will bite on it, so maybe it was just a month of fun. But ironically, while I was working on that story, Robert Coover passed away. You probably heard. He had a good long life and was, an important man of letters in many ways, and he was kind of part of that generation with William Gass and William Gaddis and John Barth and all those characters. But I always really liked Coover, and I liked his, the ambiguity that he wove into his stories and novels, which is so contrary to so much of what we learn or teach students in creative writing classes about clarity and making sure, the reader knows what's going on and so forth. Let me get back to you for a second, Grant. Did you ever read Coover's novel Noir, which is his take on the detective novel?
No, I'll have to. I read something with movie in the title or something. Collection of like someone that's got like the Ingrid Bergman, Humphrey Bogart story in it. But no, I haven't. But I'll put that on my list to track down.
Yeah, I think you would enjoy, because he plays with the classic tropes of the gumshoe detective, but yet gives it kind of his own sort of postmodern metafictive spin. So I think you would like that. Brady, are you a Coover fan? Have you read much Coover?
I am a fan, primarily the short fiction. Used to teach The Babysitter all the time. I love that story, the Borgesian forking paths, I know we're not allowed to say the word postmodern anymore, but I love postmodern fiction. So he's always been a favorite. And I think I read a couple of novels back from my doctoral exams, just a few years ago. So yeah, if I don't want to change the direction, but I do want to plant one idea. I want to go back to something that Grant said, and we can come back around to the answers to this question. But one of the things that folks might be interested in who tune into our podcast is, how do we decide on where we're going to submit work to, and how do we find, like Grant mentioned, there were some calls. Well, where does one find those calls? I think that would be eminently useful for the folks out there who are interested in, getting started in submitting to journals. Do you automatically submit, to the ones you've heard of, or is there a broader world out there? I think that might all be interesting. However, come back to Coover. There was I'm just like Grant, read those books so long ago. There was a great big fat one about Nixon, and then the baseball. There was something about baseball too, but it's been so long. So yeah, I'm no help to you, Ted.
Yeah, The Public Burning was his first book, and really put him on the map. And an interesting thing about Coover, among lots of interesting things, is that he was a really big advocate and kind of a linchpin in the establishment of digital literacy, of writing digitally, publishing digitally. Really promoted that idea, especially with his students at Brown. But yet he himself didn't do much with it. When he wrote, it was for the printed page and that kind of thing. I mean, there are a couple of projects you can find out there. There's actually a series of podcasts that are being done kind of in honor of Coover and, kind of in recognition of his passing and his contributions. And I've listened to the first one, and that was all there was at the time. But I think if anyone was interested and Googled, podcasts, Robert Coover, that you could probably find those. Speaking of how do you find places to submit, I actually have a video that I made for one of my MFA courses where I talk about that process and talk about some of the resources and some of the thinking that can go into that. And it's not exhaustive, of course, because there's a lot of ways of finding places. But yeah, I don't know, maybe I'll include that link somehow in our web, our web page when we post this podcast. Because you're right, I think there's a lot of younger writers or older writers who are just starting to become interested in publishing that they know kind of vaguely about, well, you try to find an agent and you try to find a publisher for your manuscript, but in terms of like the incremental stuff, the short stories, the poems, the essays, that's a little bit more of a mystery to a lot of folks, and yet there are some very definite resources and approaches that you can take. So yeah, that's a great point, a great idea in terms of sharing that kind of information.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Grant.
I was just going to say, and networking really helps. Like, I can't tell you how often I've had somebody tell me about something that I didn't know about. Like, yeah, there's, Duotrope and other search engines and calls for tracking down places to send. But like, there was a buddy of mine lives in North Carolina. He was at a bar and they were celebrating the launch of a new magazine called Dark Yonder. I never heard of it before. It was brand new. They were having a big party. S.A. Cosby's in the book, or in the magazine, but it's got a nice kind of book format to it. And so I looked it up. I ordered a couple of copies off Amazon, and I've sent them several stories. They haven't taken any yet, but I keep knocking at the door, chasing that white whale. I may have, and so and that was one of the places that, because I've submitted to them, and then I went to their webpage to submit again, and they were looking for stuff for the holidays, and so I thought, well, I got this story I just started working on, so what the heck, let's get that done. And so I sent off that one I was telling you guys about with the Satanists. But yeah, and the other thing is, there's the best mystery stories of the year that come out, and look at where those are. And Dark Yonder's in one of their stories got selected for that collection. So that's another way to find, besides just the obvious, right? Ellery Queen, Alfred Hitchcock. There's several other really good journals to send to. And I think the stuff I do, crime noir, is starting to take off a little bit. It's not where spec fic is. Like, spec fic has suddenly become, I mean, I'm running the Vonnegut speculative prize for fiction, and we got 648 submissions this year, which is unheard of. And I think it's a sign that there's a lot of people who are getting MFAs and MAs with emphasis in creative writing and PhDs in creative writing who are looking for places to publish spec fic outside the big, the places that pay. And I think North American Review is a little bit on the leading edge of the front of places to land spec fic stories. So that's changing. I'm hoping at some point crime fiction will become more known in literary magazine circles. It's still a bit of a battle to get those stories into those places. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, last three pieces that I've published all this past fall were speculative science fiction, which is not my normal thing, but I had started working on that project, a year or so ago, and then kind of stopped, but I had a bunch of it kind of lying around. So I just started sending chunks of it out, and all of it now has gotten picked up, and we kind of talked about that before, about sending out excerpts of novels, which is what I think of this as, and how, there's that thing, well, it needs to be standalone. And I kind of discovered many years ago that standing alone is in the eye of the beholder, and that so I had, like I said, I had this big chunk of stuff that I'd written for this dystopian novel, and very fragmentary, all, and that's kind of the idea of it.
Mhm.
And for the first part that I sent out, I kind of drew together pieces that made a pretty coherent narrative, story, with a narrative, kind of traditional narrative arc. But then for the next one, I didn't, I'd already used all that stuff for that first, so I pulled together some other stuff, and it kind of had a narrative pulse to it, and it got picked up pretty quickly. Literally, all I had left were these scraps of like characterization, character sketches, setting descriptions, whatever. So I just stuck them all together and put a title on it and sent it out. They got picked up almost immediately, So again, folks out there who might be listening or watching, don't take that standalone stuff too seriously. Let the editor, if the editor doesn't think it stands on its own 2 feet, then that's fine. But don't shoot yourself in the foot by not even bothering to send it out. So anyway, that's my advice about that.
And I think real quick on this, because I run workshops at UNI, and I can't tell you how many stories we workshop, which are chapters and novels. So I think editors are kind of getting used to it, because they're also teaching workshops, and they're also seeing a lot of spec fic coming through the classes they teach. And a lot of them are chapters from novels. So I think the landscape has changed a little bit on that, because I was told the same advice in the 80s, stand alone. You got to make these changes it's going to be different than the work of your novel. You're going to have to, make adjustments, so it has organic unity. But that's, I think we readers are getting more trained to read excerpts, just because that's the workshop reality. At least in my classes, it is. I'm constantly reading chapters of novels in progress.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Brady, do you have any thoughts on that or anything else you want to throw in?
Oh, well, just Ted, I would ask again, for the benefit of our auditors and viewers, where did you find the places to submit to, and how did you choose those places? Presumably you found more places to submit. So there was some process you had to go through to choose those venues.
Yeah, well, Grant mentioned Duotrope, and that is really my main source, duotrope.com. They, it's a subscription service. It costs a little bit of money, but not much. And they have a couple of things that are very helpful. One is they have a searchable database. And so you go to the database, and I put in, that I was looking for because if you're a journal like 12 Winters Journal and you sign up for those places, that you got to fill out this questionnaire, and you got to like check all the boxes of what kinds of fiction are you interested in, and so on the reverse of that, then as a writer, when you go to the database, one of the drop-down menus will have things like speculative science fiction, dystopian, blah, 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 blah. So you can put in these parameters, including like the length of the piece you have. There's all kinds of options that you can choose on the database before you hit, search. And so that unearthed, nothing but journals that were interested in exactly the kind of thing that I had in mind that I wanted to send out. And then the other thing that Duotrope does that is very useful, you can sign up for a weekly email newsletter that you get religiously in your inbox that lists like all the places that are now open, that are looking for whatever. And obviously looking at the title of the journal doesn't completely tell you, but obviously sci-fi journals oftentimes have a distinctive title, and so that's useful. But otherwise, you can just kind of click on it and go and see, well, what are they interested in, and that kind of thing. So those are my two main. New Pages is also very good. They have calls. And then I've done the kind of thing that Grant suggested for that story I just wrote. I thought, I'd like to get this into a little bit upper echelon journal, and so I'm going to start there. And so I have like the best American short stories of 2018. This is this old paperback. So I just go through and look and see because they not only list the contents in terms of these are the stories they've selected, but then they have a whole thing in back about like honorable mentions. These were nominations that were really good, and what magazines published them in the first place. Then they just have a boatload of magazines listed that are noteworthy or whatever. And so I've kind of been going through there. Now, the trouble with that approach is you go and you find a lot of them that are now they're not accepting submissions at this time. Whereas if you go the Duotrope route and the New Pages route, you can rest pretty well assured that if they're listing it now, that place is accepting submissions now. So anyway, those are the two approaches, the three approaches, I guess, they're really useful. Yeah, sometimes I'll see on social media a new journal or a journal that's looking for stuff, and that'll also kind of tip me off or whatever. So
yeah, the other thing too you can do is there's a writer you really admire, read their acknowledgments page or their thank you page, where they're, and they'll list people by name. They usually list their agent, but sometimes they'll list editors, and then you can track down an editor and find out what magazine they're from. So if there's a writer like a Richard Russo that you feel you write like, and he always thanks Nat Sobel Agency, but like if there's a writer you think you write like, let's say Richard Russo, you go to his books and he might mention a couple of editors. You say, editor, who's this guy? And then look them up and find out what magazine they represent. And if you feel your writing's kind of, similar, then send to that magazine. So that's another way. And the other thing is just the generosity of being a literary citizen. Other writers and find a call for something that you think might fit them. Drop them a line. I have a colleague, and I have two colleagues in my department, Jim O'Loughlin and Jeremy Schraffenberger, both 12 Winters authors, who will drop me a line every once in a while. Grant, there's this journal, Punk Noir. You should check it out. They might take something of yours. Give them a look. So I looked, and I didn't have anything right now, but it's on my horizon of expectations. It's just that they wanted short stuff, and I don't really do flash fiction. So anyway, so that's another technique, but just sort of sharing your knowledge with other writers and helping them out, being a good literary citizen, I think's another route to go. So that's the networking thing I was talking about earlier.
Well, and that reminds me of the fact that I teach in an MFA program for one university, then I teach creative writing major undergraduates at another university, and especially those characters. A lot of them have, visions of being the next J.K. Rowling or R. Martin. How many R's he has in his name? George, 3 R's Martin, et cetera. But yet, so they have this vision. Okay, they're gonna finish their manuscript. Oftentimes, it's a fantasy manuscript or it's a romance or whatever it is, and they're gonna get an agent and they're gonna get published. And then they're gonna be, in the Hamptons with James Patterson. And they don't even think about the fact that it really would be useful to have a whole list of like publications of like short stories and things like that. And so that's one of the things I really encourage them to think about, is trying to get their work out there and get some publication credits, because that is much more inclined to at least get the serious attention of an agent or someone, if they can show that they've had a dozen publications or whatever it is, as opposed to I've got 0 publications, I've just got this one manuscript and here it is, and obviously that can happen. There are stories like that of people who, get something, a whole book published and do very, very well with it, who never published anything beyond that. But I do think it's super important to, not just the experience of it, but also it really stokes your courage, your self-esteem and your self-concept. And I find that when I'm working on a longer thing, a novel or a translation that's long or whatever it is, that it can get kind of daunting. And yet, if you get something from that accepted, it can really freshen the winds in your sail, and it really brings back some focus to that project. That's what happened at that sci-fi project. I was working on that dystopian novel for a year and kind of set it aside because I didn't know where it was going or what I wanted to do with it. But so then I started sending stuff out, several months later, and lo and behold, they're getting picked up. And that really thought, maybe that's better and more worthy than what I thought it was. Maybe I need to get back to that, So anyway, the importance of those publications along the way in little journals and anthologies and all kinds of places. Yeah, absolutely. Thoughts about that, Brady, or anyone else?
Oh, well, I follow some of the same strategies. Look at poets and writers, online. It lists journals. For a long time, when I was trying to find markets for short fiction, because I read Joyce Carol Oates quite consistently, though certainly she can write faster than I can read. In the back of her multiple short story collections, it'll say where she's published. But after a while, I realized she's published everywhere. so
Right.
how to, not necessarily going to help me choose. But I do think part of the reason why I derailed all of the conversations, which after all is kind of our style as podcasters, is that I think it's mysterious to people, particularly new writers, no matter what age you are. Like we talk about, we published this or we've published that, and it's all rather mysterious, and the roads to that, and it can all take a long time, and you have to have some perseverance, and you have to be able to have the rhino hide, as my friend Davenport, always have to mention Davenport in these. But I think it's practical and useful for us to talk about these really basic strategies. Like, yeah, before you become famous, it might not hurt to work with some editors, to submit your work, to go through the process, to kind of get your bearings in the profession. Yeah, so I think when Ted posts our podcast today, we want to emphasize we're practical. we have everyday advice for folks, as well as thinking about psychoanalytic criticism, and yeah. So I'll stop.
No,
Yeah.
that's great. And actually, oh, I'm sorry, Grant, did I cut you off? Go
No,
ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure how to put this, but I, when I first started sending stuff out, I would do like a tier thing. It was such an elitist thing, right? Top echelon, middle of the road, and then bottom feeder. and then at some point, I was like, that's so snooty, like for me, I love getting published on online journals because people can get access to the stuff right away. And I remember there was a time, maybe 20, almost 30 years, because I've been writing since about 91, 92, publishing. And I think I had that idea. You want to be in Florida Review, you want to be in North America, you want to be in Georgia Review, and now I'm like, some of my all-time favorite stories were published in places like Cactus Heart and Fat City Review, and I'm very proud of those pieces. And I'm more democratic than I used to be and less elitist. Well, yeah, sure. I love getting published in a place like Ascent or Passages North or South Dakota Review, but there's a lot of other places I'm super, super proud of. And I don't shy away from saying, hey, Snowbound, that was a journal that ran for 5 years. It was all about hockey. And I published 2 stories in there. And I'm very proud of that. And the publisher just had a 5-year plan, Alan Mackinnon. That's all he was going to do, publish for 5 years. And I feel very fortunate that I got in the journal twice. So yeah, I'm less of a snob than I used to be.
Well, no, that's a great. I'm the same way. Although I did get kind of snobby with this new short story, but generally speaking, I completely agree with you. And if you look at the contributors notes of some of these, lesser known journals, the contributors have some really nice publishing credits, but yet here they are, in this startup journal or whatever. Not to mention the fact that, if you're into like the publishing history, like I've been of William Gass, obviously, but also, in the Bokoff, I've done a lot of work on, and Joyce and so forth. A lot of their early drafts of Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake or whatever it may be appeared in little journals that maybe only had 1 or 2 issues and they went away. But yet, they were publishing what ended up becoming some of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So, as are the journals that are publishing us. So, yeah. I was going to mention, I'm going to sound like somebody's dad, but I am somebody's dad, so I guess that's okay. With my undergraduates in particular, I'm now going to teach online, so I don't have any face-to-face interaction unless we do a Zoom conference. But a lot of the times they lose points because they just don't follow the directions of the assignment. And it will say very clearly, you know, you need to do these 4 things, you know, and they'll have like, and I don't write the assignments. It's a prefab, you know, curriculum, whatever. But, you know, so it's like Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2. And yet they'll turn in the assignment and they've done 2 of the 4 Roman numerals and one kind of iffy. And I tell them, you know, that one of the problems with that as a budding writer is you got to follow directions when you submit to editors and agents to the letter. And you know, submitting to journals, they'll have different, you know, guidelines, but it's pretty standard. But I'll tell you what, when you start submitting to agents, when you start looking for, you know, publishers, you know, sending to their slush piles like small presses, they will have very idiosyncratic. They want this number of pages or this number of chapters. They want a summary. They don't want a summary. They want these things. They want that. And if you don't follow directions, they love it because they can just kick your manuscript out of the pile and move on, you know? And so, you know, you don't even get off the starting line if you don't follow their directions to the letter. So my point is that to my undergrads especially is this is good practice for you. You know, if you're going to be submitting to editors and to agents and so forth, get in the habit of reading instructions carefully and following them to the letter, because you're going to just shoot yourself in the foot again and again if you you know, submit without reading writers' guidelines and following their directions and those kinds of things. So anyway,
Yeah, I you know, as an editor, I can't get over how many manuscripts come in single space. It's a real pain to read. I read them, but it doesn't, you know, incline me towards liking the piece right away. I tend to get a little persnickety about it, right? I mean, double space, people, please. I'm old. And you know, it's like academic press books. I get it. It's expensive to publish, but they all do 10 point. What the hell is with that? So you get these books, and my wife's reading one right now. I looked over my shoulder. I'm like, that's an academic press, isn't it? She goes, yeah, I can tell it's 10 point. I mean, the font is so small. The words are so, I got like some film books recently, and I was like, my eyes were straining. And I get it. It's not a big market for it. It makes less pages, but please use 12-point font when you submit to North American Review. Anyway, that's just a little pet peeve of mine. But you know, here I'm getting all grumpy about it, but there are these things that keep happening that just seem pretty obvious to me. Or if you enter a contest and it says your name is not supposed to appear on the, don't put your name on it, you know. Like there's one guy out there that only looks at RTFs, and he'll just reject everything else that comes in. It reminds me of like years ago, I heard a story about the Postmaster General received something that was mailed by a UPS and he didn't even open it, just sent it back. So if you're not going to use the USPS, I'm not opening your mail, which I thought was your package. I thought that was kind of cool. So anyway, so there you go. Some words to the young writers out there. Don't piss off editors.
well, I wanted to kind of get into some sort of heavy subconscious psychoanalytical stuff here. I don't know if we have a whole lot of time for that, looking at the, you know, the old clock here. But I'll just mention that, yeah, so this lecture that I gave, they wanted me to talk mainly about psychoanalytic criticism, but then also from the other side of it, you know, as a writer, how does all that work? And I really basically said, you know, they're kind of two different things. When I'm writing as a, you know, novel or short story or poem or whatever it is, I'm not thinking about, you know, the stuff that's going on under the surface. It's going on and it's doing its thing. You know, Gass said that he had to depend on the medium to do better than he was able to do as a conscious, clear-headed person. In other words, he had to trust the process to make the novel, novella, whatever it was, as complex and as multi-layered as it could be, basically letting his unconscious do that part while he kind of wrote consciously. And I definitely feel that way. And one of the things I talk about in this lecture is that you know, I write every morning, and I've write, you know, Monday through Friday for 35 plus years. And some mornings I would sit down and I would have a very clear sense of where I was taking the narrative. You know, I was working on a short story or a novel or whatever it might be. And the previous morning I'd had to stop, you know, at a point where I definitely knew where I was headed. So then this morning when I started start writing, I knew exactly where I was at, where I was taking my character, and so forth. And on those mornings, hopefully the writing is decent, satisfactory. But there are other mornings where I'm kind of starting over again. I finished a chapter, I finished a story, and now I'm kind of starting at a point where I don't know really what's happening, and I'm kind of staring at the blank page. And I think a lot of newer writers would say, I'm not feeling it this morning. I'll try again tomorrow or something. But I've learned that if I just start writing words, just put the tip of the pen to the paper and just start writing words, that they will start to come. And lo and behold, I've discovered that those mornings, the writing is so much better. That first draft is so much better in terms of language, in terms of complexity of multi-layered things going on than those other mornings. And my theory is that on those mornings when I have a clear path, I am mainly using the conscious part of my brain to write. And on those mornings when I have no freaking idea where I'm going, my unconscious mind kind of takes over. And it turns out my unconscious mind is a much better writer than my conscious mind is. And of course, it's in the unconscious that, the really, surrealistic images, live, and all the wish and fear stuff is going on, as Freud would say. And so anyway, I feel like the subconscious part of my brain takes over on those days when I'm not quite as sure where I'm going with the narrative. Is my theory bunk, or do you guys have some ideas about that as well? Brady, you haven't spoken for a while. Let me get back to you.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah, I love the theory, and I mean, there's so much part of the spirit we've been talking about is practical advice for folks. And I think you just hit upon some very key practical advice. Two different kinds of situations. One where I always follow Hemingway's rule, or at least I read some Hemingway said this. I read this, that stop when things are going well, like don't run the well down, and then you pick up again the next day. And so you have a plan, and yeah, it's there in your conscious mind. But I completely agree. I mean, what I'm interested in very often in writing is not so much event, is trying to explore why people do what they do. What motivates, and if you're in a situation, what are your thoughts? Why are you acting the way you're acting? And I think that's really deep. And I think we don't always know why we do what we do. And so that less degree of consciousness and allowing those deeper wells, the deep repositories of emotion and experience, ambition, desire, all that stuff that if you believe Freud is below the level of the conscious mind, how are you going to tap into it? So we spoke earlier, Ted referenced the Journey to Al Ramal. There's a lot of strange stuff in there, and I sometimes would be writing and go, where does that come from? Right? Like I apparently am the one who's pressing the keys, and so it's not wholly conscious. It's that repository of experience, where there's a lot of hardship. And yeah, so I think tapping into that and not just trying to keep things blithe and bright and on the surface and logical and reasonable. Yeah, there's something in us that's profound and deep, perhaps. And I like that idea, Ted, of just one word after another, because how can you tap into that? Grant's a big fan of Kerouac. Kerouac has some theories about this as well. So I'll stop. But yeah, I guess all I've done in very long, circuitous way, Ted, is agree with you completely. And yeah.
Grant, what are your thoughts on the role of the subconscious?
Well, I love what you're saying. And I agree that it works for you. But for me, I'm not a planner. I mean, but I have to be in a certain zone. I don't know what it is. It's just, I've tried to write every day. I can't. But then when I'm ready to write, I know when I'm ready to write, I feel it. And I sit down and I write for like 40 days straight and pound something out. But I don't feel like I have an outline or a plan. So I feel I do tap into that unconscious stuff, but I'm not ready to do it every day. It's like I got to feed the lake. And what I mean by that is read other stuff, watch a lot of noir, digest, some criticism, literary criticism helps, film scholarship. And then it's like, it's not sexy. It's kind of sex. I don't know how to explain, but suddenly I feel this, energy, this, maybe it's libidinous. I don't know. But I've got it. I got the energy. Let's do it. And I don't know where it's going to go. And so I think I do reach those deeper levels that you guys are talking about. But I can't, if I just stare at a blank page and say, I'm going to write today, I write shit. I have tried. And so it has never worked for me. But if there's like this jazzy, feeling I have, and it's like, okay, let's do it. And I do it. And that's how it works for me. I'm not recommending that process for everyone, but that's my process, if that makes any sense. And I do the Hemingway thing a lot. Like, I'll keep writing and I'll stop at a point where things are really, because it's like I know where I can pick up tomorrow, and then I pick up tomorrow and it just keeps going. So I constantly do that trick. That is a trick I've definitely taken from Hemingway. And the other trick is, and maybe it's because I've written a lot, but I got to the point now where first thought, best thought. I trust my instincts, and if I have an impulse, let's do it. And they're usually pretty good. Sometimes I'm like, bad choice, later, but most of the time my impulses are good. So I'm always just looking for what's the next impulse going to be, and I don't know. So it's, to me, it's putting myself in uncertainty and being comfortable with that. That's my whole trick as a writer.
Right, right. Well, I do want to move on to the short story we're going to talk about, but after that Islamabad lecture, the students had read my story. What did they read? Oh, Vox Humana, which is a experimental piece. And then afterwards, there was a Q&A. And a lot of the questions were about psychoanalytic criticism and things I talked about in the lecture on that side of the equation. But several students asked questions about Vox Humana and about my writing process. And they had some really interesting questions about it. And they had readings of it that were really sophisticated, way more sophisticated than I felt I was writing it at the time, but it's like, oh my gosh, that is happening in the story. That's really interesting. And so, but again, I know a lot of writers have had that experience where, after a reading, people will make observations and point out some really interesting things that are happening in the text. And they're like, yeah, I never even thought of that, and I know, Brady, you recently gave a reading where the students talked about one of your stories. Did they point out some genius in that you were not aware of yourself?
Oh, well, okay. So no, there was no accusations of genius. Yeah, yeah. Where's that golden day? No, but I'm totally at peace with, like, I have an idea for a story. However, by whatever means, you get the words down, you send it out into the world, it finds a home, somebody reads it. I am totally at peace that they are having a whole other experience of that story than I have, and that I am, like, the notion of authorship seems a little, kind of comic almost to me. I hardly know why I do anything, and I hardly know what the words all mean when you put them in that sequence in a sentence, and then you have two sentences, then you have a paragraph, and then you have pages, and then you have a story. What does all that add up to? And the detonations of imagery and the detonations of language, I am not the author, I am not the controller of those. And so, yeah, I've had that experience. Folks, make observations, come up to you after reading and talk to you, and they'll say they really like this, and you're just like, wow. And I think that's great. Like, that's part of the relationship between reader, book, or text, and writer. And it should be, I always tell my students that there are limits to interpretation. Like, in my mind, Moby Dick is not about the Martian invasion of Earth. That seems to me wrong. But pretty short of that, and the ways that language, and the way that Ted was talking originally, the way that we tap into things that we may not know about, who knows what's in those stories? Who knows what wells what things are speaking through us. So yeah, that's, for me, it's one of the great pleasures is that, yeah, wow, that's not how I saw it at all, but that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I've maybe in a previous podcast, I talked about how my MFA students, especially this semester, I've been working with a bunch on their thesis, for their final project and so forth. And so much of the time they talk about how they want the reader to do this. They're sequencing things so the reader will understand this, or the reader. It's like you have no idea, what the reader's going to do with this. I mean, so write well, make decisions based on what you want to do with the text. But once it gets out of your hands, there's no way to predict how any reader, how any editor, how any agent, whatever, is going to respond to it, because response is very idiosyncratic. Yet, I do think there's a lot of writers who feel like every word choice, every plot twist is going to have a sort of concrete, predictable impact on every reader that reads it, and that just ain't the case. I don't know, Grant, do you ever deal with that in workshop, that kind of idea?
Yeah, absolutely. I was trying to do this in the story, or this all was true, and or I thought I wrote a likable character. The analogy, if I could draw one, and it might be kind of tricky, but it's like acting in a scene. There are lines that are written, but I don't know what I'm going to do moment to moment until my scene partner does something. And if she gives me a line a certain way, it makes me react differently than the night before. That's just how it is. And I think there's a similar thing on the page when you're writing and you're writing characters. They start to speak for themselves, and you don't know what's going to take place. And I've worked with actors that have got frustrated with me in a scene because they wanted me to say a line a certain way, because they already had an overdetermined idea of what they want to do with the next line. And I'm like, no, this is moment to moment. I didn't feel like saying it that way. That's, and in their mind, they've scripted this sort of intentions for the, they've, got all the objectives figured out, and they feel like, and I don't force me to do a line reading so you can do something a certain way. And I feel like writing is avoiding line readings. It's a mysterious process, and I do believe there's textual intent, but textual intent, I'm borrowing this from Seymour Chapman. Textual intent is different from authorial intent. I don't always know what my intentions are. Often I don't know, just like what Brady was saying. I write the story, and I leave that to people to figure out, but I don't have an agenda or an ideological definition of what I'm trying to do. I just, here's the story. And sure, there's moment to moment choices I'll make. Well, it's like, well, I don't want to present like a woman in a certain way because that's stereotypical. So yeah, there is that kind of governance over what I'm doing. But for the most part, it's just being in the moment and channeling. Bob Dylan says, I have no idea what my songs meant in this. I was just channeling. And that's why I wrote all those songs in the 60s. And I kind of feel there's something about that with writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's turn to our featured story.
Yeah.
So this is from the literary journal Booth, and number 19, very recently out. I did reference this a podcast or two ago because along with this came Michael Martone's autobiographical work, and it was packaged together. I don't think I mentioned that in that episode. There was like a band around it. So the only way to get the Michael Martone's little book was to have it come with Booth. So that's very cool. But I'll tell you what, I had a heck of a time deciding which story to send you guys, because typically just terrific stories in this. It's just one right after another. It's like, oh my gosh, I'd love to send this one to these guys because the conversation would be so cool. But I found one that I wanted to share with you guys and get your reaction for a couple of reasons. One, it is a little bit on the shorter side, and we're all super busy right now. But the name of the story is The Girl Goes Missing, and it's by a writer named Courtney Craggett. I presume that's how you say Courtney's name. And I'll say more about her in just a few minutes, as I always do. But, regular viewers, listeners of our podcast know that we've had a few stories about missing girls or abusing women and so forth. And I didn't really want to have another story like that. But on the other hand, this story is kind of about that phenomenon, that trend. And so I thought, well, that's kind of cool. That's kind of an interesting commentary on a lot of the stories. Well, not a lot, a few of the stories that we've done over the last couple of years. So again, the story is The Girl Goes Missing, Courtney Craggett, booth number 19. And I'll just read from the beginning of the story. And I am going to say to you guys, we normally don't try to give the ending away because we want to, encourage people to maybe get a hold of the story. And that actually happens from time to time. But I think to really discuss this one legitimately, we do have to talk about the end of it. So, anyway, I'm just going to, so don't be afraid to mention the end. We normally try to avoid it, but I think maybe we should be okay with that. So this is The Girl Goes Missing. This is the beginning of it. The girl goes missing and her family sounds the alarm. She has never been missing before, not like this, not for so long without warning. The girl is the light of the whole kingdom, radiant smile, golden laughter, lilac perfume. The king and queen never imagined this would happen. Now that's just the first couple of short paragraphs. I'll kind of stop there, but I'll just say that the story is written, and I know this is only for viewers, but in little vignettes, little short vignettes, and it's a very brief story, period. But each of the sections is very brief, and it's about the search for this missing girl, but obviously it's set in this sort of fairy tale magical kingdom to begin with. But then throughout this story, Courtney Craggett, the author, definitely lets you know that this is sort of an allegory for girls now, and not that every girl goes missing in terms of being abducted, thankfully, but girls sort of disappear and become, the happy, smiling, radiant little girl seems to disappear and become someone else, I guess in the teenage years oftentimes. So anyway, I'm gonna stop there. I know you guys probably have lots of things to say about this story. So Grant, let me kick it over to you. Do you have some thoughts on The Girl Goes Missing?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I'll make it quick so we can really get into this because first off, and Brady probably can relate to this too, having raised a daughter, but I have 3 daughters, and it seemed like with all 3 of them, 4th and 5th grade were kind of the highlights. And then there's that rough period of junior high and or middle school, depending on what educational system you're part of in whatever state or country you're in. And the objectification that happens, and not just objectification, but like my middle daughter's queer, and she suddenly lost all her friends around 6th grade because she just didn't want to talk about boys. She wasn't interesting because she wasn't doing makeup. There was like all this stuff that I don't think the other girls realized. They weren't being mean girls. It was just Elizabeth didn't fit with the stuff that they were suddenly into, and she was no longer being invited to their slumber parties or, let's watch a Hitchcock film together or that sort of thing. And so it's tough, and they do go missing. I think, at least that was my experience watching all 3 of my daughters. 4th and 5th grade, fantastic, and then 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, it was rough, and then they kind of find themselves again. So I could relate to that in the story. I also felt this is a story. This is just my opinion, and this isn't a criticism. Because the way I'm talking about art is I'm very character driven and impulse and all that. But this is a story that feels thematic to me, and there's nothing wrong with that. Whatever works for you as an artist, God bless. I mean, I'm not like, oh, there's only one way to write. I totally agree with what Brady said. I believe in pluralism. I believe I could write. We all 3 of us could decide to write a story, and with characters and situation, we all could write a successful story. There's not only one way to write a successful story. So for me, I kind of liked how this dared. When I was in getting my PhD, I studied film, and one of the things I remember coming up constantly was, "My pleasure is to destroy your pleasure." And I fucking hated that, right? I was like, "Why are you even studying film if you hate this stuff? You're just going to run down every movie and talk about the ideology and blah 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 blah." But there's an element of that to this story, and yet it's creating art, and it's positive. It's like here's this problem. I'm presenting this problem, and look at the words I use as an artist. I'm creating art. And then at the end, I'm trying to write a new story, like here's an alternative story. So I really appreciated that about the piece. It's like, if you don't like the way art's created, then create a different art. Like that to me is what some of the great feminist filmmakers. That's what I think Patricia Rosamond has done in her career, a Canadian filmmaker. It's like without even anyway, those are my thoughts, my initial thoughts to this piece, but I really, really liked it. And I thought it was daring because it's not the way I would write a story, but I think it accomplishes what it sets out to do in a marvelous way.
Yeah, really interesting. Brady, what are your thoughts on this story?
Oh yeah, I thought this was a great story. It's elemental. It addresses a profound narrative pattern. I think the writing is great. Yeah, this story, for some of the reasons that Grant said, set me back on my heels. I remember Grant won't even perhaps know this, but I remember talking with Karen one time, long before I was a parent, but you guys were. And Karen had said, yeah, there's a certain age where it's possible she'd seen the pattern where the self-esteem of young women plummets.
Yes.
And that always kind of stuck with me. My own experience, complicated, sort of becoming a single parent to a young girl. Yeah, so this one hit hard, and if I may, I won't try not to ruin the ending, or will ruin the ending, but if I could I think there's something so elemental and so elegant about the writing. If I may just read from this. So this is it's just a very short story. So I think this is into the second page. What they do not know, or maybe know but do not realize, is that in every story the girl goes missing. It's the way of the world. The girl goes missing, and maybe she's in a tower with a sorceress who climbs her long hair. Or maybe she is in a cabin with 7 dwarves working in the mines. And it skips down later on and says, the girl goes missing, and maybe she has lost her voice and now lives on land. And maybe she has been turned into a swan by a wizard. And maybe she is buried in the desert in Juarez. Or maybe she is discarded behind a dumpster. Like the turn from the fairy tale, folktale setting, and then immediately hauling it back into our very visceral, very violent, often very violent world, and the issues that it addresses. Yeah, I guess I'm just saying the same thing over and over again. But yeah, such a great story. Hits hard. It succeeds, I think, because it is so spare and stripped down, and is not this sort of complex exploration of character or a firebolt plot. It's this is what is going on. Stop, think. Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, I'm going to continue you stopped before the line, and maybe she is hiding in her room with the curtains drawn dark. In every story, the girl goes missing. So that also, speaks so much. Yeah, I taught, as you guys know, high school English for 38 years, and I was shocked so many times where I would have these young women in my class. I taught almost exclusively seniors, so we're talking 17, 18-year-olds. These girls, these young women, who, from my perspective, should have the world by the tail. I mean, they are smart, they are funny, they are critically minded, they're attractive, they got just every thing going for them that you could possibly think of. And then they'll write these stories or these essays where they talk about how their self-esteem is shot, and nobody respects them, nobody likes them, or I'll find out that they're having they're cutters, and they're having all these emotional issues, or they have eating disorders. It's like, how you ought to be running the place, and you have this so little self-esteem. I never understood that, but yet it was just a common pattern. All of these young women who just had so much going for them. And meanwhile, you'd have the boy who seemed to not care about anything, not have any ambition, not have any goals, couldn't tell a 2x4 from a whatever. And, they were just full of confidence, just, absolutely on top of the world. Now maybe they had some issues too. I shouldn't be judgmental, but there is that phenomenon that males can sound very in charge and very confident when in fact below the surface they have no idea what they're doing, vice versa. But anyway, yeah, it's just amazing the issues that we run into along those lines. Yeah, Grant, I'll kick it back to you. Did you have anything else you want to say in particular?
Well, yeah, I myself, as you guys know, I write crime stories, and a lot of my crime stories, the girl goes missing, right? I mean, in a physical sense, and so I feel I'm contributing to these narratives that need to be maybe deconstructed or considered. And so I really like the turn about agency and then writing a story. It's like that idea I was always taught in film, school. Film criticism was the desire to desire and who desires, and so that idea of writing the story to affect a future outcome, I thought was really cool. And that's one way that we can change the narrative is by changing the art, and like I remember, I'm old enough, and Brady and I are close to the same age, but I can remember a prejudice against women's fiction, to be honest with you. Older professors that thought, that the canon didn't need to be letting in all this stuff that's, like a Western should be a Western, not about, sewing and whatever, cooking. And but why can't a Western take on those elements and be about stillness and about taking care of the homestead? Like, who's to say that has to be a gunfight at 12 o'clock high? I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, but I had, stories about war were somehow universal, but stories about some of the things that a woman might be going through was just seen as a woman's fiction. And they put that quote in front of that. And I'm not saying this was everyone's thing, but I can remember male professors I admired that was and I'm going back to the late 70s or early 80s here with this analysis, but that's changed. And I think part of it is, our department at UNI is over 50% women in profit. So I think there's a shift in demographics and a shift in the kind of stuff that gets taught, and it's a long time coming. So I think it's good, and I think it's good to have that diversity. So anyway, I appreciated the turn at the end. It's a little bit hopeful, but it's not completely hopeful. I mean, but it's what art requires. I think is different perspectives, and it helps us all to see the world in fresh new ways.
Yeah, Brady, do you have any thoughts on that in particular?
Oh, well, yeah, no, I agree. The revision of stories, I think we all in our small measure have some part to play in some of the stories in the term between. I was very conscious of writing stories. I wanted, part of what I was up to, or wanted, I don't know how successfully, but was writing about women in masculinist spaces, in spaces typically, run by dudes. There's a story about kayaking and, sort of this dude culture. And so part of how I tried to get at the problem of how women fit in or where women are is try to not conceal, but didn't make plain any, the genders of particularly the women characters, that had only emerged in time. So the way that women have to perhaps accommodate themselves in some situations, let's hope not. Yeah, I think fiction has a role to play in this world. Yeah. Yeah, and I like the ending to touch on that as Grant does. There's a note of hope. Yeah. I should say too. It occurred to me while Grant was speaking. I don't know what your classes are like, but for example, next semester I'm teaching a course on the Brontes and the Gothic, and I don't know how anybody identifies, and so I suppose in some I don't have much ground to stand on, but just a quick glance at the roster, I believe it's 22 or 23 women and possibly 2 dudes. The realm of literary studies, at least in my experience in the last 10 years, certainly is the realm of women, and I think that's a great change.
Yeah. Well, let me read Courtney's contributor's note here. Courtney Craggett is the author of the story collection Tornado Season from Black Lawrence Press that was published in 2019. Her short stories appear in The Pinch, Mid-American Review, Baltimore Review, Washington Square Review, Cut Bank, Monkey Bicycle, and elsewhere. She holds a PhD in creative writing from the University of North Texas and teaches at Weber State University. And I don't know, this is kind of hopefully an interesting observation. Maybe it means nothing, but I always try and find our featured authors online and see if they have websites. And she doesn't seem to. But this other kind of interesting thing is she seems to have kind of disappeared. I don't mean physically, thankfully. I mean, she has some very recent publications that you can find online. And in fact, the one I read, it has a very similar kind of tone to this one. So this seems to be a style that she particularly likes to write in. But what I mean by that is if you go to the faculty page at Weber, most of the faculty have like pictures of themselves. Well, hers is like a black shadow. It's been cut out, that kind of thing. And then a couple of other professors are that way too. Well, actually, I think there were 5, and 4 of the 5 are women. That's a whole other interesting issue. And then I tried to find her on social media, and I found that she had an X account. And I thought, oh, well, good. I can kind of contact her through X because I normally let the authors know they were the featured author. Well, I know she hasn't posted like since 2021 or something. She still has an account. So, and I couldn't find her on Blue Sky. I couldn't find her. And she has a Facebook account, but again, hasn't posted in ages. So she seems to have sort of disappeared from the public arena, which, it is interesting given her interest in the disappearing female persona. Now, the online is the Wild West, and I talked to my undergrads because the course that I tend to teach there is about developing author websites and social media accounts to support their writing, et cetera. And I just make it very clear that if you do that, you are opening yourself up to potential harassment, and certain demographic groups, women in particular and people of color, et cetera, are much more prone to get trolls who, send, mean things to them and so forth and so on. So, it is a difficult place to be online, social media, particularly for females, again, particularly for people of color, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know if that has played into her sort of withdrawing from the public arena somewhat. But anyway, it's just interesting given the theme of this story and that kind of thing. So I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that or what that may, how we might interpret that somehow?
I mean, it could be all that, but I'm always uncomfortable speculating on stuff like that. I mean, for me, it's a matter of privacy. I mean, I really don't like being out on social platforms and all that stuff. There's just a lot of mean-spirited people out there, and I just don't want to engage with that. I have my subscription to The Athletic. I follow the Leafs, my Argos, Grey Cup champions. But I follow that stuff, and I post every once in a while, and you just get clowns that respond and say mean things. And my point wasn't a mean spirit. My point was praising a player for doing something, and then someone's got to weigh in with, whatever, way to go, champ, something like, well, what's with this? Why do we live in this kind of snarky time where everyone, like, where's sincerity? I don't know. I'm sorry to be all crabby today, but I'm okay with being invisible when it comes to social media, I guess. Anyway.
No, I get it. Great. What are your thoughts there?
Oh, I hate social media. But I like my friends. and it's not possible in, we're all so scattered. And so it's a, yeah, it's a struggle. If I had my way, I'd close my accounts. Part of me wants that, and the other part wants and feels great about staying in touch with folks. But there's different ways to do that, and so maybe a lazy person's way is through social media. Yeah, and yeah, I can't speculate on Courtney's situation, though. I certainly understand the impulse to fall out of the social media world.
Right. Well, I've had this really interesting phenomenon of experience just the last week regarding social media. I joined Blue Sky, which is sort of the alternative to X, because X has gotten to be such a mean-spirited place, not to mention, its owner is highly questionable in terms of his ethics and motivations and blah, 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 blah. And so I migrated over to Blue Sky. And this was just last week. I did this, I don't know, Thursday, maybe a week ago today or something. I don't remember, but just about a week ago. And it was wonderful because, there are all these writers and scholars and librarians and so forth on it. And it was like this like coming together, like we found each other again here on Blue Sky. And it reminded me of the early days of Twitter. I joined Twitter in 2007. Most people hadn't even heard of Twitter, but I was just following other writers and other people who had, book interests and so forth. Well, so last week, I did like a daily post about this, that, or the other, and people were liking it, people were sharing it, and I got into some like conversations with fellow writers online. It just felt wonderful. Well, then I noticed like over the weekend that like people stopped responding to my posts. And meanwhile, Blue Sky kept posting, oh, another 2 million people have joined Blue Sky today. Oh, today another 2 million people have joined, oh, Mark Hamill has joined Blue Sky, and then NPR and all these news organizations are now on Blue Sky. And I think what happened was, in just the course of a week, so many millions of people joined Blue Sky that it suddenly lost all of its charm, and I was just another minuscule fish in the sea. No one's seeing my stuff. No one's responding to it. You're just isolated among the millions again, and it's just like, wow. And then I also noticed like a day or two ago, somebody was saying, okay, now the trolls have started to migrate over to Blue Sky.
Yeah.
For a few days, you could depend on nothing but sunshine and radiance. And now people are starting to come just to say mean things and, and so forth. Like, oh my gosh, can we not have anything nice, but, let me, again, I really admire this story of Courtney Craggetts. And like I said, I read another story of hers online, which I really, really liked. And was a very similar kind of style to this. Maybe she writes some other stuff that's way different than all this, but these two were kind of consistently the same. So I highly recommend Booth 19 for for everything, but including the little, bonus book that comes along with it. Let me kind of wrap this up and come back to you guys for any kind of final thoughts before I hit stop record. Grant, do you have some? Can you end on a sunny note? You've been such a Debbie Downer today.
Oh, sunny note. Thanksgiving is coming, and I don't want to get all religious or philosophical, but I do think it's important for personal wellness to practice gratitude. It's a whole thing now that therapists talk about, and it increases your life expectancy and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that I'm grateful for, and I don't need to do the whole litany of them here on a podcast, but I do try to say what I'm thankful for, every day, and I've found it does help my mood post election. Let's just leave it at that, shall we?
Well, Grant, we are thankful for you, even when you're in a grumpy mood. So,
thanks.
Brady, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think despair can easily sink its hooks in us, and I am conscious of that. And I think the antidotes are, and I don't know how effective these are against the travails of life, against the turmoils of the world, but as Grant just said, friends and family and some gratitude, and we don't retreat into books, but we look to books for other experiences and help us understand the lives of other folks and other times and other places. And we don't have, and it's all imperfect, and we don't have great access, but it is an antidote to despair. It is a way to read as an act in some ways of compassion, and a route to empathy and understanding. And so, yeah, two things: don't despair, work against that, and in the writing life, hang in there, keep going.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Enjoy.
Well, I just one quick note, as I've mentioned, I did that lecture with the students in Islamabad earlier this week, and tonight I'm zooming into Hue, Vietnam, to give a keynote address at a conference. And I know you guys have experienced this too, as I travel around the world, as I connect with people around the world, either in person or digitally, we've got a big tribe. I mean, we are part of a really terrific community of human beings, writers and scholars and readers across the globe. And I felt so connected to those young students in Islamabad in a way that I don't feel that connection with, quite frankly, a lot of people right here on my home turf. But again, my people are in Vietnam, they are in Singapore, they are in Morocco, they are in India. We're all over the place. And I think that's something to take some heart into, that there are good souls, good people all over the world. And if we just connect with people as individuals and don't worry about ideologies, and don't worry about what our governments are doing to each other, but how can we connect as human beings? That's really, really important.
Yeah, amen. That's great.
All right. Well, thank you guys. I promise I will be in touch regarding your books. And otherwise I'll get this uploaded, but thank you guys again. And thank our listeners and viewers, and we'll see you in about a month or so.
All right. See you, everybody.